Let's talk about why the move c5 in this position is a bad idea for white, because I think a lot of beginners would look at this and say, no, that looks like a really nice idea. I mean, you shut down, you're kind of cramping black's position, you're shutting down the bishop from coming out, it's well defended, you could even push this here and have a nice pawn chain. Like, why shouldn't I push my pawn forward? Here's why. The author lists 5 reasons in the book. It boils down to 2 main things, though. Number 1 is you lose the tension. You lose the ability to make this pawn trade at the right moment when it might be beneficial to you. When you push by, it's just like everything is locked up. You can't do that. He also mentions some other things like the C file is no longer going to be able to be opened once you push this. You can't use a rook or a queen here because your pawn is going to be blocking it. Another thing he mentions is that sometimes you want to put a knight or a bishop on that square. Like a knight on c5 would be very powerful, but you can't if your pawn's there because you can't take your own pieces, right? So all of those reasons, it's not usually a good idea. Also, he mentions developing your pieces is usually what you want to be doing in the opening, not moving pawns, right? I'm going to give you a bonus reason why I think it's not a good idea is because the move e5. And when black plays e5, they now have total control over the center. And normally, when black plays e5, the response that you want to play is to capture that pawn, right? But now it's no good for you because look at this. Bishop takes c5. That pawn that you thought was good is getting captured already with a developing move from black. They have a rock solid center here that you don't have any pressure on because you've gotten rid of this pawn. And this guy on e5 is a doubled pawn and a weakness. And black's going to simply probably bring the knight and the queen and eventually take that when they're ready. And black already has an advantage out of the opening. Okay, so generally speaking, do not push this forward. You want the tension on the center. And you're usually pretty happy if they take you because they lose a center pawn. Your bishop comes out, right? And so just keep that in mind. c5, very common beginner move that's just not very good. All right. Welcome to episode 19, by the way, in a series where we're going through this book, Logical Chess Move by Move. Let's start at the beginning. So d4, d5, the Queen's Gambit, and black plays what's called the Slav defense. Okay, you can also play the Queen's Gambit decline to defend your pawn. The issue with this is you do block your bishop immediately. In the Slav, you leave that available if you want to bring the bishop out. Now, it's not always a good idea because sometimes you can run into trouble with the queen attacking on b7 once your bishop leaves. So just keep that in mind, but we do have the slot. Let's keep going. So white plays, instead of pushing, they play knight to f3, which stops e5. It's a developing move, keeps the tension, everything that we talked about. Very, very good move for white. Okay. Black plays the move e6. Now, there's something that the author mentions here, actually, and I'm going to back up before I get too far ahead of myself. Knight to f3. He mentions how a master can play a move like this very quickly, and it's going to be like one of the top moves in the position, whereas a beginner might sit there for 10 minutes thinking and then play a move like c5, and it's actually a bad move, right? And he talks about how the master understands these positional concepts and ideas or principles, whatever you want to call them, and they can very quickly just understand intuitively, like, no, that's just not a good idea, right? Like, I could just tell you, because of e5, I just don't want to play that move. I don't even have to think about all the little details. I just know instinctively I don't want to do that. Whereas knight to f3, absolutely, it's probably the best move with the position. If I look at what Stockfish says, guess what? Knight f3 is one of the top choices, right? Without even calculating, I just kind of knew that. So very important that you understand these principles. Okay, now that I've said that, let's keep going. So e6. So black decides, you know what? I'm just going to leave the bishop there. So this is defended. Yes, I'll have to deal with my bishop later, but my position is super solid. I have no weaknesses. I have no targets for my opponent to attack, and they're right. There's nothing wrong with this. Black's position is very solid at this point. All right, so white plays the move e3, same kind of thing. They decide, you know what? I'll leave the bishop back for now. It'll come out later when I'm ready. I won't have to worry about any attacks on my b2 pawn in the meantime. Okay, knight to f6, bishop to d3. He mentions how, as a very general principle, developing the king side pieces before the queen side pieces makes sense because then you can castle very quickly. Okay. Now I say as a very general principle, like I don't want you guys to think this is a hard and fast rule of like, no, I always have to develop my knight and my bishop first because you might miss opportunities in your games to move the other pieces somewhere good. Okay. But just very, very general principle. You can do that if you want. All right. Let's keep going. Knight b to d7, very solid square for the knight. And here white plays the move knight b to d2. Now I have a question for you guys. Why did they move here instead of going to c3? Isn't knight to c3 better? And if so, why did they choose this? Well, the general rule says yes, c3 and f3, f6 and c6 are the best squares for the knight. However, there are always exceptions to the rules in chess, right? And one thing that I'll point out in this situation, the pawn on c6 is actually doing a really nice job of stopping this knight from moving forward. Okay, so because the pawn is already there, I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't really know if I want my knight on c3. On d2, you still get the support on e4 like you would from c3, but you also get support here, which is nice because if black ever takes this, you can capture with the knight instead of the bishop, jump your knight over here to e5, and you're able to keep a knight on e5, which could be kind of a nice idea, right? So that's something to think about, and I think that's probably what was going through white's mind, okay? So knight b to d2, and black plays the move bishop to e7, developing the bishop. White decides to castle, which is smart, gets the king to safety behind the wall of pawns, always a good idea. And black plays the move queen to c7. Now, the author mentions, excuse me, the author mentions that at this point, black probably should have played c5. And this is a key idea. We've talked about it already. I'm going to keep talking about it, but in these d4, d5 openings, either c5 or e5 has to happen at some point for black. And if you don't do that, usually you get into trouble. You don't have very good games, right? And so black should have taken this opportunity to go ahead and push that forward and start creating the tension in the center and freeing up their position. They decided to play this move instead, and they never really got a chance. All right. So e4. Now white's going on the offensive, right? And now if you're black, you don't really have time to stop and play c5 because there's all this threat, tension on d5. You're going to get into trouble. Even e5 is actually probably even more powerful, just kicking the knight away. It's just a bad situation for black. So they decide to take. They don't want to allow that pawn to push forward, like I mentioned. And now if you're playing as white, do you take with the bishop or do you take with the knight? Well, that was a relatively easy question. You take with the knight. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, you want to let your bishop out. Okay, even though you block it temporarily, you want to look for opportunities later in the game to let that bishop out. That's what white is doing. And also you keep your nice attacking bishop here on d3. Okay, this is a very good attacking piece a lot of times for white. And so it has to do with the fact that the king starts on a light colored square, I think. And also when they castle, it's just lined up directly on attacking the king. And so if you can keep the bishop, that's a good idea. So black decides to trade, plays the move knight to f6 to attack the bishop. And now I have a question for you guys. Let's say you want to save the bishop and you're thinking about retreating it. Where do you move to and why? Which of these squares do you think is the best square for the bishop? All right. Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move that was played and what I would agree with is probably the best is bishop to c2. Now let's talk about this one at a time. b1, the problem is you block your rook, right? So eventually this bishop's going to move and you might want to use your rook at some point. And now you can't. It's stuck in the corner. So I don't really like that. d3 is not bad, but you do block your queen from defending d4. And when you go to c2, you get the option to play queen to d3. Now, why is this a nice thing? Because you create a battery, which is when two long-range pieces are lined up on the same file or diagonal. But you create the battery with the queen in front. Okay, this is really, really valuable because imagine if black castles. Now you have a queen and a bishop lined up threatening checkmate if this knight ever moves. Or maybe you could even just go and trade it off and you have a simple checkmate threat. Okay, for example, if black castles, you play queen d3, they're not paying attention, the game is just over. It's much more powerful to have a battery with the queen in front than the other way around. For example, if I go bishop d3, the castle, I play queen c2, I have a battery, but the bishop's in front. So now it's still a bad move for black, but it's not checkmate. The game goes on and who knows what's going to happen, right? So you can just see the power of that. So all of those reasons, I think bishop to c2 was the was the best decision. All right, let's keep going here. All right, now at this point in the game, the author mentions that white has a superior position because of four major reasons. Number one, his bishops have greater range than their counterparts, okay? These bishops are very, very well placed, right? You can see they're controlling a lot of the board. They have a lot of options for where they want to go to. And black's bishops, not so much, right? Don't have a ton of choices there. Number two, he dominates the center with the pawns. Look at these pawns. 1, 2, 3, 4. Very, very well placed pawns. Usually pawns placed side by side are very good. And there's not even any pressure on them. Like black's not even attacking them. So white doesn't have anything to worry about. So very, very nice position there. Controls the important e5 squares. Another reason. Look at this. We talked about c5 and e5. Black's not able to play e5 to let this bishop out because the knight is controlling in the pawn. c5 probably black's last sort of ditch effort to open up the position and put pressure on the center. Okay, but they don't do it, which we're going to see in just a second. And then fourth, White's major pieces, so major pieces in chess are queens and rooks, can operate along these files very nicely, right? It's very easy for white to play rook e1, or if you want to move your queen somewhere and bring the rook to d1, or even move this bishop and then bring this. Very quick and easy, whereas black, the rooks are going to need some time before they can come over to the center. Okay, so all those things, small things, but they add up to an advantage for white. Okay, and here black plays the move b6. Again, they're not playing the c5 move early enough. They're doing all this other stuff, waiting. I'm sure they're intending to do it. They're just too slow. Okay, so b6, trying to get their bishop out. White plays queen to e2, adds another supporter to this e5 square. We get bishop to b7 and knight to e5, a magnificent outpost for the knight, is what the author says. Now, an outpost in chess usually is when no pawns of your opponent can control that square, right? To where the piece can't be chased away. This isn't technically an outpost by that definition because this f-pawn could move forward at some point in the future and attack the knight. The problem is that's not easy for black to do, right? Because you have to move the knight first, but even if you did, let's just say you did this, for example, and then you played f6, that's not necessarily a good move in this position because there's queen h5 tactics, and you're going to get into trouble, right? For example, on g6, you could simply take this, right? You can't take back because of the rook. It's just a bad situation for black. So even if you did try to do that, I don't think you would want to play f6. So because of that, it's a very nice square for the white knight. So black decides to play rook d8, putting some pressure on the center, and at this moment, let me see if this is the moment. No, not yet. Sorry, next move. So rook to d1, white simply defends. Okay, that was attacked. They defend, bring the rook over. At this moment, black castles. And now this is kind of a critical moment, I would say, in the position. Okay, you have the advantage that we talked about. Your bishops are more active. You have more control over the center. You have this really nice knight in the center. But what do? How do you kind of follow up on that? Well, the answer is bishop to f4, and it's a logical move that makes a lot of sense, right? It was the last piece that wasn't developed. Not only are you developing it, but you're creating a threat. And the question I have for you guys is, what is the threat? Specifically, what is the move that white is threatening to play next? All right, well, if you had a chance to think about that, let's just say, for example, black plays a bad move here like a6. The threat was knight to g6. Now, it had to be knight to g6 specifically, because what knight to g6 does is it unleashes the bishop, first of all, but it also defends the bishop and attacks the rook, okay? So ideally, what you're trying to do is simply take the rook and win the exchange, knight for rook. The reason you have to go to g6 is because if you thought you could play, let's just say knight takes f7, now black simply takes your bishop because the bishop's undefended. And even though you get the rook, they get a knight and a bishop, and all you got was a rook and a pawn. That's an even trade, but it's actually better for black, and now black is the one who has the advantage in the position, okay? So knight to g6 specifically was the threat. Also, knight takes c6 doesn't work. The queen sidesteps the bishop, and you lose your knight at the same time. And so this was the threat that I was looking for, knight to g6, okay? So black says, all right, well, I better deal with that. They play the move bishop to d6 to block off the threat on the queen. All right? And again, I would say we have kind of a critical moment, right? Because again, white has a nice position, but if you don't figure out a way to kind of break through, black's going to be able to equalize and start trading off pieces and go into an endgame, right? So what do you play here if you're white? What's the move? All right, well, if you had a chance to think about that, the move is c5. And again, we see this idea, right? When the opponent doesn't play c5 and it gets prevented, their position just is bad, right? That's just what we see, right? This bishop never really got into the game. They never got to put the pressure on white, and now white is the one who is initiating, and this is a very powerful move for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you just move back, well, you walk into the threat that we already talked about, knight to g6, right? There you go, and you're going to lose your rook. You don't want to do that. If you take it, which is what they decided to, oh, one more thing. They did take it in the game. But if they take here, watch what happens. Bishop takes, attacks the queen. If you go to e7 to try to defend your knight, you walk into d6 and get a skewer there. If you go back to c8, look at this. Takes, takes. And if you would like to pause, there's an amazing move here for white. What do you think it is? Well, the move for white is bishop takes h7 check. And the idea is that when the king takes, you're going to try to checkmate the king along these two files, okay? And the way that you do it is start with the queen check to force the king over, because you want to be able to put your queen here with a tempo. Okay, so that's why you start with the check. Now you go back, check again, so it doesn't give black time to create a defensive idea, right? That's what you're doing. And now the rook comes up. The rook comes up and over. We do a rook lift for the win. And because of the way that we did that, black has no way to deal with this. Okay, now I want to point something out. If you immediately played queen to g4, thinking, okay, next move I'll go here and come over, it gives black time to go rook d5, rook g5, and they've created a safe place for their king. It's no longer checkmate. That's why it was critically important that you threw in that check first, then you go here with check, and now you play here. They don't have time. They're too slow. It's game over, right? You can't stop checkmate. So, very, very important, but very nice position. All right, let's go back. So that's what happens if black decides to try to take here right away. And so they decided, nope, let me take here instead. So white captures. Of course, black doesn't want to do this and walk into the pit, the discovered attack, excuse me, right? Again, you're going to lose the exchange. So they say, okay, let me move my queen. Actually, they trade first. And then they move their queen to a5. So notice this was not an option before because the pawn was in the way, right? They traded the pawn first. Now they play queen to a5, trying to give themselves some options. Now, the question that I have for you, and think carefully about this, is can white do the same thing that they just did? Can they do the same thing that they just did? Trade, sacrifice, checkmate the king. The answer is no. You can't do the exact same thing because if you trade, which they did trade, but if you try the sacrifice now, it doesn't work because look at the rook. You could go check. You could go check. But when you bring your rook up, it just gets captured, right? You have no ability to do a rook lift to deliver the checkmate. So the Greek gift sacrifice with the bishop there on h7 does not work in this position. So because of that, white had to find a different idea. What do you think they played? Well, the answer is queen to g4 check. And the reason is we're trying to force the king in the corner so that we can go with the follow-up queen to h4, which threatens checkmate. And really, black has no way to stop it except to play the move f5, which they do. They shut off the bishop. Now, at this moment, I would like you guys to pause and try to figure out how does white proceed. If you're an advanced player or a stronger player above, let's just say if you're above 1600 rated, you can go ahead and just pause right here and try to find the best move for white. If you are a beginner or an intermediate player, I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint, and then you can pause and try to find the move. Okay, the hint is you don't always have to win a game with a checkmating attack. There are other ways, right? That's your hint. All right, so at this point, hopefully everybody had a chance to pause and think through the position. The move that white played is queen to e7. Now, it's a tricky move because in this position, you're threatening checkmate and you're focusing on the fact that the king side is weak. It's exposed. There's all these open, spaces. The problem is you don't have a way to finish it off, right? The bishop is blocked out. The rook can't come up and over anymore because black has control of that file. And the queen by itself is not powerful enough. Like you're going to need another piece to support the queen, right? So white says, okay, what I can do instead is shift my focus to something else in the position. And they're attacking the bishop, but there's also another threat, which is very difficult to see. In fact, I didn't see it myself when I was looking at this game. So you're going to realize it when they play the next move, but there's a secondary threat that the move queen to e7 has. Very, very clever. Okay, so black plays bishop c8, saves the bishop. And now if you would like to pause again, what is white's final move? They actually caused their opponent to resign after they played this next move. Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is b4. And what you're doing, this is called a deflection tactic, okay? A deflection tactic. White is attacking the rook 2 times. It's currently defended 2 times. But when you play the move b4, look at the queen's path along the diagonal to defend the rook. You can't go there. You can't go there. And now you see the idea of queen e7. White wanted to take away control of this square so that after the move b4 was played, you force the queen off of the diagonal. So if they take, you simply win a rook. Good game. If they don't take, what else are they going to do? They could trade, but they still have the problem now of a double attack, right? Both of these pieces are under attack. So if you take, again, you lose the rook, and you can't go back here because we just take the queen. And if you try to get tricky and play something like this, hoping the white will take you, well, white's not going to do that. They're going to go with an in-between Zwischenzug tactic, check, and then take the queen, right? And so however you look at it, the game is just basically over. Black's forced to lose a rook. So really, really good idea, though, from white to notice that, okay, I can't finish the attack. I'm out of pieces. Let me shift my focus over here and take advantage of what's going on with the rook and the bishop and the queen not having a lot of options. Okay, so really good idea. Tough one to find. Like I said, don't feel bad if you didn't see that move, Queen E7, because I didn't see this idea before myself as I was looking at the game. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll see you next time for game 20. And we're really learning a lot about these C5. The C5 move really, I feel like, is the key takeaway from all these lessons so far. If you're black playing in a D4, D5 opening, you've got to play C5. Otherwise, it's not going to end well for you. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll see you next time. Stay sharp, play smart, take care.